So good morning and welcome. My name is Jimmy Marr. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm Policy Director for Safe Horizon, the nation's largest nonprofit victim assistance organization. We're gathering virtually this morning to urge the New York State Legislature to pass a critical piece of legislation that will be life-changing for survivors of domestic violence, trafficking, and sexual violence across New York State. The Securing Access to Fair and Equal Shelter Act, or Safe Shelter Act, that's Assembly Bill A2583 and Senate Bill S15, sponsored by Assemblymember Andrew Hevesy and State Senator Andrew Gennardis, would expand access to domestic violence shelters to adult survivors without children. Domestic violence shelters provide a safe, secure home to survivors of violence and abuse. And there, they can be connected to counseling and mental health supports, housing resources, financial assistance, and so much more. But the domestic violence shelter system across New York State, including New York City, was really designed for survivors with children. So very few units are actually set aside for survivors entering DV shelter without children. New York State reimburses domestic violence shelter providers on a per person, per night basis. And this heads in beds reimbursement system means that a shelter provider that places a single survivor without children in a unit with 2 or more beds will lose the very revenue we need to operate our DV shelter. That revenue covers rent, 24-hour staffing, utilities, and other operating expenses. Providers just simply can't afford to downsize every unit. And when we use downsize, that means taking a room that's meant for 1 adult and 1 child to accommodate 1 single adult. Even though single adult survivors make up half of the requests for domestic violence shelter every day, domestic violence providers cannot afford to downsize a room meant for a parent and a child to accommodate every single adult survivor seeking life-saving services. This outdated system harms survivors without children, so that disproportionately affects marginalized communities, including trafficking survivors, survivors who identify as LGBTQIA+, and older adults, so those survivors that are more likely to try to enter into the shelter system without children. The Safe Shelter Act will fix this long-standing problem by reimbursing a domestic violence shelter provider for the entire unit when we place a single adult survivor in a room with 2 beds. This is common sense. I know everybody says that about their bill, but this really is a common sense solution. And it will change the lives of survivors immediately, and it will change the lives of our providers and our dedicated staff immediately as well, who have to answer those frantic calls from survivors trying to get into shelter and say that there's no space available for them, or for our dedicated shelter staff who know how life-changing the shelter system is today. So today we have a mighty coalition of providers across New York State, and we're joined by several of them this morning. You'll hear from them. Urban Resource Institute, or URI, the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, or NYSCADV, and Volunteers of America of Greater New York. You'll hear from them this morning why it is critical we pass the Safe Shelter Act in both chambers before the end of the legislative session this week. And we're asking folks to call their assembly member and their state senator today to get this common sense and life-changing bill across the finish line. So you've heard enough from me, so I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, and that is the voice of a survivor. So I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa Santiago.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Vanessa Santiago, and I am a survivor of domestic violence. And I wanted to start off by saying how important this bill needs to be passed because it affected me being a single individual coming out of a domestic violence situation. And I had at the time, well, I still have my 3 dogs, but they were very young. They were 6 months old. My story starts off by saying I was formerly incarcerated. I did 17 and a half years. When I came home, I went home to a person that I barely even knew, and I had to leave. I had to leave right away. And during the time that I was released, it was in March 2020, so it was COVID. So there was nothing available. Due to my being incarcerated, I had some mental health and psychological issues that I felt that I needed to adopt my 3 babies to protect me and keep me safe, So I had them with me, and unfortunately, I had to return back to the same city where my abuser was. And during that time, he threatened me and my baby, my three dogs. And I knew I had to leave that city, which was in Syracuse, and I had to come to New York City. And when I came here, I I needed to find shelter right away for two reasons. One, I had my three dogs, and for myself, but also because I was on parole. So shelter was very important for me to remain out in society without getting a violation and returning back to prison. And when I tried to find a place, I was told I had called like Safe Horizon or different domestic violence through the phone. I was told that they would not accept my animals if I didn't right away. Like a person with children would come before my needs with my dogs because that's just the way the law is. And I felt very discouraged about that because to me, my dogs are my babies. I don't have children. So just as you would take care of a child, I take care of my dogs the same way, by feeding them and teaching them things. And they also are also my ESA animals. So I needed their support as well. So when I couldn't find shelter, I resorted to finding people that can deal with formerly incarcerated people to see if I can get in through that way. And I was able to reach a program in it's called Warm. Um, we all really matter, and through this lady Stephanie, I believe her name McGraw, she helped me get into Hope House, but the condition was I had to place my animals. I had to give them to someone to hold until I was able to get shelter for all of us. And our opening didn't open up to about like 3 weeks with PALS, which is People and Animals Living Safely through URI. But prior to that, I was sleeping in cars, I was sleeping in people's couches. Nobody really wants to accept anybody that has free animals. And it took me a very long time to finally get settled in. And for me, if this bill was passed, I wouldn't have to have endure sleeping in the streets, knowing that I was on parole, risking my release. Because if you don't have shelter, you can get violated. And also, my dogs were young. They were 6 months. They needed to be sheltered. They couldn't be in the street. They were subjected to a lot of danger, especially inside of my vehicle and stuff like that. So, without this bill, if we don't have this bill, um, I feel that there's a lot of people out there that will miss the opportunity of being successful in society. People that have dealt with domestic violence, people that have been incarcerated, people that just couldn't afford to live and ended up homeless. I feel that with this bill, it will help secure uh, just offer that sense of security and also enforce others to open up, like to create more housing that allows animals and single participants to occupy the space. I find that very important. Just so you know, during my release being out here, I opened up a nonprofit, and in this nonprofit, I witnessed so many individuals that were unable to take care of their animals. They were living in the street and stuff like that. And I realized the necessity of having to have a bill that allows these single participants like myself to be able to eventually get a place and become successful. Without this opportunity, I would never be where I'm at today. I'm currently doing my doctorate in criminal justice. I still have my animals. I help other people. So having this bill opens the door for more than just one thing. It's a very important necessity. It needs to be passed, and I will dedicate my entire life making sure that it does.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And I think that your remarks are really getting to the heart of the matter, that how incredibly difficult it is for single adult survivors to get into to access domestic violence shelter. And it becomes that much more complicated when a survivor does have pets. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we want to pass this week so that we don't have to keep fighting. I know we're all dedicated, we're dedicating our lives to this, but we want to get this bill passed this week. So now I'm just going to turn it over to Safe Horizons Chief Program Officer, Kelly Coyne.
Thanks, Jimmy, and thanks, Vanessa, for that really moving story. I think it really brings to light how important it is that we get this bill passed this week. It's personal stories like yours that reinforce why this is so important. For Safe Horizon and domestic violence providers across the state, it's our absolute mission to make sure that when survivors contact us, we can help them without fail. It's our commitment to protect survivors and to make sure that when they are fleeing a violent and abusive situation, they have a safe place to go. We cannot continue to have the constraints of room size and financial penalties due to ineffective government policies be the deciding factor for who gets placed into safe dwelling or who goes another day facing danger from the person who's causing them harm. We often find our hands tied with red tape and have to tell a single adult survivor that their options for shelter are limited simply because they're entering our shelter systems by themselves. Where is the equality for adult survivors? Single survivor safety matters too. At Safe Horizon, our 24-hour hotline answers about 90,000 phone calls each year, 40,000 of whom are folks requesting shelter. Last year alone, half of those callers were single adults looking for safe shelter. Sadly, we could only connect 18% of those callers to a domestic violence shelter for intake. Keep in mind, about a quarter of the hotline calls are for people who are traveling with one child or more, and we're able to connect 72% of those folks to shelter. The fact remains that domestic violence, sexual abuse, and human trafficking do not discriminate between adults that are single and those who are traveling with their families. And keep in mind, this is the third day of June, and we're all happily celebrating Pride. So it's time that we raise awareness about the inequality that LGBTQAI+ individuals who are experiencing violence and abuse seek when seeking safe shelter. Many of those survivors are single adults who find trouble accessing shelter simply because they do not have children entering shelter with them. We need the New York State legislator to understand without the passage of the Safe Shelters Act, you are putting the lives of single adults at risk and compromising the integrity of providers. Again, single survivors deserve safety too. All single survivors matter. This bill would give providers the flexibility and increased capacity we've been seeking for years to support single adults. We want all single adult survivors to know that as providers, we are here for you and you are not alone. Safety is for all survivors. Legislator, please make this reality this week. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you for speaking to the fact that this issue is getting worse and worse, that it's becoming more and more difficult for single survivors to be able to access domestic violence shelter. So we need to get this passed this year. Survivors can't wait another year. And now I'm going to turn it over to Carmen Fernandez, Assistant Section Director of Domestic Violence Programs at Volunteers of America.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us here with you guys today. As I would like to say that as one of the largest shelter operators in the state, it is critically important that our DV sites be effectively funded to meet the needs of adults without children fleeing abuse. Many of residents who present for DV shelter services do not have children. At one point, as many as 30% of the residents at our sites were single. Our DV shelter programs run a deficit due to the under-occupancy. We are unable to build the full cost of services when we are under due to accepting singles in need of shelter. Our fixed costs for staffing and OTPS remain unchanged. Last year, like many other agencies, we lost millions of dollars due to under-occupancy. Our programs are designed to accommodate the head of households with children. However, 2 out of 5 referrals we receive are for singles. We can only afford to accept the maximum of 5 at most of our sites in order to keep the programs fiscally solvent. Right now, at this moment, we are on the 75% occupancy. And we must say that each head of household deserves the same level of support, and it will be irresponsible to cut back on critical staffing and support for residents merely because the demographics of our clients are changing. We are urgently need the Safe Shelter Act to pass so we can afford to offer life-saving services to all survivors.
Thank you so much, Carmen. All of your points are so critically important, and that's why we need to pass the Safe Shelter Act this year. This week, the session ends on June 6th. And we'll have a call to action. There's something that each of you can do. But now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lenore Schaefer, Director of Economic Empowerment for Restore NYC.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Dr. Lenore Schaefer, and I'm the Director of Economic Empowerment at Restore. We are an anti-trafficking organization dedicated to making freedom real for survivors of trafficking. So today I'm speaking on behalf of Restore and the survivors that we serve. Restore builds on the strength of survivors, and we offer services through client services, housing, and economic empowerment programs. And we believe in a housing first philosophy and emphasize the need for safe and stable housing as a foundation for any other form of support we provide. It actually was our hope to have a survivor leader speak today and share their experience trying to access shelter after exiting trafficking. But unfortunately, this was not possible because the reality is that we often come across survivors of trafficking who can't find shelter because there aren't enough options available for single individuals, which has been shared before. Because of these limitations, they often end up leaving Restore if we can't connect them to temporary housing. Once we lose touch with them, we are unable to provide other essential support focused on their long-term needs. You know, if we can't support them with an immediate need like securing a safe place to sleep, they remain in crisis and cannot focus on other critical aspects of their recovery, such as processing their trauma through the mental health services we provide or seeking employment. So the impact on survivors of trafficking is immense. Not all survivors of trafficking have children, and not all survivors have children with them while being trafficked, especially those who are trafficked internationally or whose children are with other family members or in foster care. So this makes it difficult for the majority of survivors of trafficking to access domestic violence shelters. Because of this, they're remaining in unsafe situations while double occupancy beds go unfilled. And I also want to emphasize that being denied shelter is itself traumatic, right? Many survivors are experiencing complex trauma, and when they attempt to rebuild their lives and when they're facing rejection because they don't qualify for available beds, it reinforces the lies told by traffickers, right? So lies like, you won't get help, or I'm the only one who can take care of you, or you won't have a place to live and you're going to have to come back to me anyway. This keeps them feeling stuck, isolated, and without choices. It's not uncommon for survivors to tell us at Restore that they feel compelled to return to their trafficker when they learn they can't access a safe place. So this bill is a critical piece of legislation designed to address these limitations and provide solutions. It makes it easier for survivors of trafficking to access safe and secure temporary housing, which is crucial to reduce their vulnerability to re-trafficking and other exploitative situations. Again, this is really crucial. So this bill is a necessary step towards ensuring that all survivors, regardless of their family status, have access to safe housing that they need and the housing that they deserve. So I'm honored to join, my partners in the field, talking about this issue. And I'm urging legislators, other community leaders, and the general public to support this and help us make freedom a reality for all survivors. And I think together we can ensure that no survivor is left without the essential support and stability that they need to rebuild their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lenore. And the Safe Shelter Act came out of an anti-trafficking roundtable where stakeholders were trying to figure out how can we really help trafficking survivors find safety, find long-term security. And of course, we still have so much more that we need to do in the housing space, but there's always going to be a need for domestic violence shelter. And we want to make those critical supports accessible to all the survivors of trafficking, of domestic violence, of sexual violence that need and deserve it. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Amanda Eckhart, Chief Program Officer for URI.
Thank you, Jimmy. It's an honor to be here with each of you this morning. Again, I'm Dr. Amanda Eckhart, Chief Program Officer at Urban Resource Institute. We are the largest provider of domestic violence shelter services in the country and a leading provider of housing for individuals experiencing homelessness right here in New York City. On any given night, we offer shelter to approximately 3,900 people. And that includes adults, it includes children, it includes pets, like Vanessa's little ones that we saw there in the camera, in the safety of one of our 24 temporary homes. At Urban Resource Institute, we are committed to breaking cycles of violence and homelessness. So beyond our housing services, we offer trauma-informed and client-centered economic empowerment services. We also work in over 40 middle school and high schools with youth and also in communities across New York City to disrupt cycles of violence. And we engage those who've caused harm in the solutions to end violence. Currently, as you have heard, we are facing a critical issue here in New York City, and I'm going to highlight some of the data, so illuminate some of these numbers for us here this morning. There is a rising number of single survivors of domestic violence and other forms of violence, including human trafficking and sexual assault. Kelly had mentioned some of these stats. This past year, we saw the highest number than any other year in the history of New York City of singles seeking access to shelter. And unfortunately, the city's domestic violence shelter system is not designed to accommodate these survivors. We have in the system approximately 2,800 beds, and only 111 are for singles. This is 4%, or just 1 in 25 beds. However, like Kelly just mentioned, over half of the referrals to our city shelter system are for singles. In the most recent calendar year, we had over 3,000 singles who called the city hotline operated by Safe Horizon seeking shelter. So what does this mean in very practical terms? According from data to the hotline last calendar year, over 2,500 singles were turned away from emergency shelter. And that is an average of 7 single survivors being turned away each and every day from shelters. That translates to 1 person every 3 hours. And we know, as we've heard this morning, this disproportionately impacts LGBTQAI+ survivors. It disproportionately impacts male survivors and also survivors with adult children. And so we are envisioning as a community, a collective of nonprofit providers, those that you see here on the call, and then also in the broader sector, the transformative impact that might happen if this bill becomes law. We're envisioning that together. We know it won't cost the state anything more than what they've currently budgeted. And when they say yes to the Safe Shelter Act, together we can extend safety to over 50% of the survivors who call seeking shelter. This would, of course, prevent folks from remaining in unsafe situations, as we've heard from Lenore and others, being redirected into the general homeless shelter system or ending up on the streets. This would mean that single survivors, in addition to housing, would have access to the array of social services that are part of that continuum of care that we've heard described this morning from our partners. And these are some of the very best partners in the sector providing those services. That includes services like economic empowerment, legal services, crime victim services, and more. So this morning, we urge you together as a collective of nonprofits to support the Safe Shelter Act, which will make shelters safer and more welcoming for all survivors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And now our final speaker before we wrap things up and turn to Q&A, Joan Gerhardt, Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thank you for having me today. For those who don't know, the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence is a statewide not-for-profit that represents the voices of domestic violence survivors, their families, and domestic violence service providers across the state. This morning, you've heard from speakers about how the current system impacts single adults seeking shelter primarily in New York City. I'd like to focus my comments on how upstate domestic violence survivors and shelter providers are impacted. Outside of the larger cities like Rochester and Buffalo, upstate domestic violence programs are relatively small. Many cover large geographic areas. Of course, the population is much smaller here, but the demand for shelter is just as strong. This is not to say that domestic violence shelters in upstate communities are fully occupied at all times. Their occupancy rates can fluctuate significantly. They can be fully occupied one week and 50% occupied the next. And like New York City programs, they are only paid when a domestic violence survivor is actually residing in shelter in a bed, despite having to front the money for staffing and supplies for full occupancy. This makes it very difficult for these agencies to budget and plan. Many upstate domestic violence programs operate safe dwellings, not large shelters. A safe dwelling has the capacity to house up to 9 adults and children experiencing domestic violence. It's typical for domestic violence programs that run safe dwellings to fluctuate between operating in the red and in the black. Their margins are extremely tight, and they are rarely profitable or even fiscally sound. Not receiving reimbursement for open beds, despite having to front expenses for staffing and supplies, places these agencies in a difficult financial situation at the very start of each contract year. Many are not able to turn it around during the duration of their contracts. Within this context, when upstate domestic violence programs are faced with the option of housing an adult with children or housing a single adult, they will likely choose to house the adult with children. This will result in them receiving more reimbursement, which ultimately means a healthier bottom line. If they choose to house the single adult in a double occupancy room, based on a 180-day shelter stay, a domestic violence program stands to lose nearly $21,000. This loss could be catastrophic for even the most financially sound domestic violence program. I want to reiterate that this is not due to a desire not to house single adults. It's purely financial, a Hobson's choice, if you will. Regardless of other factors, domestic violence programs will likely house families in favor of single adults purely because they can bring in more revenue doing so. This gets to the heart of what the Safe Shelter Act seeks to address. I'd like to thank Assemblymember Hevesi and Senator Gounardes for their willingness to work with NYSCADV and domestic violence advocates to craft and champion the Safe Shelter Act. NYSCADV will continue collaborating with them, with legislative leaders, and with all of you to ensure the Safe Shelter Act is enacted this week. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you so much, Joan. So we heard from Vanessa, but I do want to just share a few more survivor stories that we gathered from Safe Horizons 24-hour domestic violence hotline and also our 8 domestic violence shelters. So first, Beth, a 60-year-old survivor with a disability who called the domestic violence hotline with an ER social worker. Beth had been assaulted by her partner and needed a safe place to stay and figure out her next steps. There were no spaces available for her, and there were no shelter providers that were able to downsize a unit to accommodate Beth. Carol, who shared that she is undocumented and was attacked by her boyfriend while she was at work. Carol was fired from her job and did not know where to go. She called the hotline 16 times over 3 days in hopes of finding a single space in a domestic violence shelter, but there's no available space. And then on the flip side, we have Ray. Ray was living with his ex-boyfriend who was very abusive, and Ray had nowhere else to live. He opted to stay in Washington Square Park instead. Fortunately, Ray was connected to services and was able to access domestic violence shelter. And while in shelter, he was able to reconnect to health and mental health services. This month, Ray was able to move into a supportive housing unit for older adults. Maribel, who has also been in a Safe Horizon domestic violence shelter. She's been in shelter for about 2 months. She shared that she struggled with years of substance use issues. She shares that the stability offered by a domestic violence shelter has helped her to maintain her sobriety, allowing to focus on herself and on the next steps of her healing journey, including employment and long-term housing. And lastly, Luz. Luz, who identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community, has faced a lot of discrimination and trauma throughout her life. She sought domestic violence shelter to find safety and security from her abusive relationship. Throughout her stay, she expressed how happy she was that she was accepted, as she would have been homeless otherwise. After nearly 6 months in one of Safe Horizon's domestic violence shelters, Luz was approved for supportive housing and able to move into her own unit, and she was ecstatic to find her own home. So we want to pass the Safe Shelter Act this week for survivors like Beth and Carol who haven't been able to access domestic violence shelter, but also survivors like Ray, Maribel, and Luz who have been able to get into shelter and are on a more long-term healing journey. We want to create more survivors who have access to paths of safety and healing. So thanks for joining us today. To sum up, the percentage of single adult survivors seeking domestic violence shelter is increasing, but it is becoming increasingly more difficult for them to find placement in life-saving domestic violence shelter and accessing the services they deserve. This is a matter of fairness and equity. And this legislation, like folks have said, is budget neutral, and that the money for domestic violence shelter has already been appropriated by the state. This is a common sense bill. It is the right thing to do. We need to pass the Safe Shelter Act this week. So we're asking folks to call your assembly member, to call your state senator, and say that you are asking for them to support and to pass the Safe Shelter Act this week. Again, that's Assembly Bill 2583 and Senate Bill S15, sponsored by Assembly Member Andrew Hevesy and State Senator Andrew Gennardis. So with that, I'll just open it up for Q&A. I do see that there, one quick one, I know folks were asking about the recording. We are recording this. This link will live live on YouTube, and we will share out the link via email and via social media. We didn't ask people to register for this, so we don't have folks' email addresses, but we will be able to share out the link the way that we shared out the information about this webinar. And there's a question about APIP, Abusive Partner Intervention Programs. So this bill doesn't directly address APIPs, but I would say that there's a whole host of things that we need to be doing in this sector, including on building out supports for people who have caused harm. One thing that's coming to mind is we do have survivors who they may decide that they want to remain in their relationship with the person who's causing them harm, with their abuser, their abusive partner. We use these terms interchangeably sometimes, but maybe they want a safe temporary space while their partner is being connected to services, receiving the services that they may also need. One of the survivor stories that we gathered was from somebody, a mother who decided that it was best for her child who had special needs for her children to remain with their father while she went into shelter temporarily so that she could get the resources that she needed to do. And during her time in shelter, she was promoted at her job. She finished an associate degree program. And since she's looking for better economic opportunities, and she's has engaged in a bachelor degree program, and she has a housing voucher. So she could actually find housing for her and her children so that the three of them could live together once again. So that's what's coming to mind when I'm thinking about how this is connected to APIPs. So thank you all so much for joining us. Are there any other questions before we leave you today? All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We are a mighty coalition. And I feel good. I know that we're going to get the Safe Shelter Act passed this week, so that we can continue to do more for the survivors that we serve and the survivors across New York State.